What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Home Built Workshop. Have you guys ever needed to create a router template to route a specific size and shape cavity and you want to make sure it's done really accurate and repeatably? Well, I am working on this Cigar Box guitar and I need a template to make the pickup cavity for this really small humbucking pickup. We're going to put it in this guitar, but I need a template to do that nice and clean. We're going to lay one out by hand. This is going to apply to a lot of projects, not just guitar making. Stick around, check it out. A router with a template bit and a good quality template can get you some awesome results in whatever project you're working on. Now, just because I'm working on a guitar and I need to make a pickup cavity does not mean that you can't benefit from this technique. A few other uses that come to mind would be maybe a clock. Maybe you need to inset the clock mechanism in the back of something that you're turning into a clock. This would work for that clock mechanism. Maybe you need to install a battery compartment into some sort of a project. Maybe it's a guitar, maybe it's something else. Any sort of application where you need to put a precisely sized recess into an object, this is going to work for you. Let's jump right in, get this done. We're going to use some 1/2" MDF for this. This is just a scrap. We'll square it up. It's going to work perfectly. We don't need anything too big. Now, I do recommend using MDF when you're making templates. A few reasons is it's almost always nice and flat. It's very stable. You don't tend to get it warp and twist under normal circumstances as long as you keep it dry and stuff. You get nice smooth edges. You don't have to worry about grain. You don't have to worry about it splitting. It's just a very stable, and it works great for stuff like this. So here's the pickup that I need the template for. Now this does have this trim ring which is going to cover up most of the cavity. So really we could get away with just kind of roughly hacking it out, but we want it to look nice and neat underneath there. I don't want it to just be a mess of chopped up wood and stuff like that. I'm going to end up removing this trim plate because really it doesn't apply to this application. What we are concerned with is this plate along the bottom. This is what we're going to do all of our measurements and modeling after, because this ultimately is what needs to fit in the hole, not the trim ring. And since your application may be different, you will need to determine what the size of the opening needs to be based on whatever it is you're making a template for. If it's a Clockworks, obviously the little clock mechanism is what needs to be fit in there, and that's what we're going to be able to trace around and work with. The first thing I'm going to do is square up my piece of MDF, and this is purely so I have nice straight square lines to work off of. If you could somehow make an odd shape like this work for you, then there's no reason you really need to square it up, especially for something maybe like a clock. I keep thinking clock because that's just what comes to mind that you might need to be working on that's not a guitar, but really if you can work with whatever odd shape your scrap is, it's fine. I want mine nice and square just so I can have some center lines and stuff on there to help me line it up on the instrument. You may or may not need some center lines, but I can definitely see where they could come in handy for certain projects. Now I'm going to very carefully measure the pickup and make sure I have all my dimensions in order before I get started laying this out. This one's about 1.5 inches by 2 1/8. If I don't write it down, I'll forget. So now I'm going to transfer those measurements to my piece of MDF, but I'm going to lay it out right in the center using those center lines. Just by taking the measurements off of this, I can transfer that onto the piece, and that's going to give me the basic outline. We still need to add the tabs. That's going to be easy. I'm just going to line that up now in my lines, and we can just trace those in. As I'm tracing it, I'm looking down through the screw hole on the pickup and I can see my center line underneath. That's how I know I'm centered on that line. Just because the pencil is not exactly against the edge, it's going to give us just enough of an offset where if we cut to that line, we're going to be fine. We're going to need that little bit of extra clearance to make sure the pickup has a little bit of room in the cavity. Now, of course, I could have just traced this out, done no measurements, and gotten a template that's going to work fine because this is going to be covered by a trim ring. And your application may be similar, but if it's not, you're going to need to go off of measurements, and that's why I laid this out based off of measurements. You want to try to be as accurate as you can, and since everybody's application is different, yours may need tighter tolerances, or it could be lesser tolerances if it has something like this pickup where there's a trim ring that's going to hide really any irregularities. So I could have gone a little bit bigger and not worried about it, but I like to go off the measurements, try to make it as accurate as I can. So now all we need to do is remove this material from the center. Now here is a step where you can use whatever tools you have available. I'm going to drill a few pilot holes and then use my scroll saw, but you don't have to use a scroll saw. You can use anything you have, any sort of handsaw, a jigsaw, anything, as long as you can carefully and fairly accurately cut to the line. We're not going to go exactly to the line. We're going to fine tune that once we get the majority of this material removed. Now to remove the remainder of the material, I had to dig out a tool that I don't use all that often. This is my old scroll saw. I've had this thing for quite a while. It doesn't get used a whole lot, once in a while on certain projects, but nothing against it or anything. It's just something I don't use very much, but it does work awesome for stuff like this where you can need to get into the center. It works great. Now again, if you don't have a scroll saw, not a big deal. You can just use whatever methods you have to remove this material. One thing you might consider is drilling holes at all the inside corners, and then you can just connect the dots basically to remove the waste. Drilling the holes ahead of time would make the corners nice and clean, if that matters. Otherwise, use something like a coping saw or some other small saw and just connect the dots. Now using the scroll saw, I'm just going to take my time and very carefully cut out the center piece. I'm trying to cut close to my pencil line, but I want to leave the line. We're going to clean that up in a little bit. I don't want to risk going too far. Ta-da! Now we just got to clean it up. So cutting it out on the scroll saw really doesn't take all that much time. It goes pretty fast. But now is where we need to take the time using files, rasps, sandpaper to get the fit exactly where it needs to be. I'm going to carefully file away until I get down to my pencil line. I'm also paying close attention to not file at an angle. I want to try to keep the sides of this nice and square. Once I get really close to my pencil line, I'm going to finalize that fit with these sanding sticks. These things are pretty cool. I don't use them all that often, but for stuff like this, I think they work really good. And after a little bit of work, we've got a template that our pickup fits through nicely. Just a little bit of play either way, which is good. Gives us just a little bit of alignment when we go to put everything in place. Our pickup ring will cover everything beautifully. Let's test it out. Now I'm going to apply some low-tack masking tape to the surface of the cigar box. The low tack is going to prevent it from peeling up any of the decals on this cigar box, as well as give the double-sided tape something else to stick to. It works very similar to the CA glue and painter's tape trick in that it's going to allow the template to come right off. And now using a good sharp template bit in my router, I'll route that pickup cavity. Now in a perfect world, I would have liked to have been able to remove the lid from this cigar box and use the scroll saw to remove the bulk of the material. But this lid doesn't come off, so I couldn't do that. I ended up having to use this bit like a plunge bit and plunge it right down into the surface. I took several very light passes to get down to the full depth that I needed. And here you can see how easily the template peels off with no damage to the finish of this box. So now we have a nice fitted pickup cavity. Trim ring will go right on there, and that's really going to finish off this guitar. It's going to work great. So there you have it, guys, a quick template made out of MDF to fit a custom 3-string cigar box guitar pickup or whatever it is that you happen to be working on. One thing I want to point out and make sure to keep in mind that your router bearing is going to have a rounded profile. You're not going to get square corners. The smaller the bearing on your router bit, the tighter the radius is going to be. So just keep that in mind. If you need a square corner, you might have to do a little bit of handwork to get everything to fit, but keep in mind that you're just going to have a rounded profile. Yes, I have a lot of square corners on here. No, they're not square on this template, but it's okay. Since it was sized just a little bit larger than the pickup, it's going to fit just fine. But I just want to point that out, make sure you keep that in mind. No matter how square and clean your corners are on your template, your router bit is not going to give you the exact same thing. You're going to get a rounded corner, but the smaller the router bit you use, the tighter that radius is going to be and closer to square-ish corners you're going to get. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. I hope you found this helpful. We'll see you next time. That's shot back, I'm telling you. Sounds bad.